Every who down in Who Newville liked the holidays a ton, but where to get great prices on gifts they had no idea. None. They searched and they searched for great gifts under $25. Gifts for spouses and friends and even their toddlers. When suddenly one who shouted, Walmart has what you want, knowing they have Lego, Tree Hut, and no prices to flaunt. So they enjoy the holiday season as Who's often do. Cheering and shouting, Walmart has incredible gifts. Who knew? Find gifts they'll love under $25 at Walmart.
Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. Enjoy comfortable rooms and friendly service when you stay with Hilton instead. Save up to 25% this season when you book with Hilton. Hilton for the stay. Terms apply.
Lindemann was a very inspired man, grumpy, bad-tempered, fantastically important to Churchill. In 1933, when Hitler came to power and decided that there weren't going to be any more Jews in universities, and somebody pointed out to Hitler that actually it was mainly the Jews who were doing the science, and Hitler said, in that case, we'll do without science. So a lot of unemployed Jewish brilliant intellectuals, nuclear physicists and the like. And Lindemann took his Rolls Royce, drove to Germany, drove around the universities and collected them.
Welcome to the Spymasters podcast. I'm your host, Antonia Senior. Every fortnight, I interview the best writers in the business talking about spies, fact and fiction, historical and contemporary. In this episode, I'll talk to the brilliant novelist Jane Thynne about her new book, just out, Midnight in Vienna. It's set in 1938 in London and Vienna. The Sunday Times said, evocative in its period detail and gripping in its narrative drive, this is a highly enjoyable novel, and I couldn't agree more. Jane has written numerous books, including the acclaimed Clara Vine series of spy novels and standalones like The Words I Never Wrote. She's also written 2 recent books under the pen name C.J. Carey about a dystopian counterfactual world in which Hitler won the war. Today we'll be talking about the 1930s, about the importance of writing fiction about World War II, and of course about spies. There are so many top interviews coming up on the Spymasters podcast, so don't forget, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and never miss an episode. And now I'll hand you over to me talking to Jane about Midnight in Vienna. Jane, thank you so much for coming on the Spymasters podcast. We're delighted to have you on.
It's a great pleasure. And I mean, I love this podcast, so huge honour to be on it.
Thank you so much. We're here to talk about your new book, Midnight in Vienna. I could not have loved this book more. I couldn't put it down. I think I read it in a day, and I read fast, but even for me, that's quite something.
I like the fact that it's that, you know, one's not bogged down for a week in it. Actually, that I kind of wanted that. I wanted it to be mildly more lighthearted than my previous novels. The last 2 novels I wrote under a pen name, and they were dystopias or alternate histories, and they were quite bleak in a way. And so I just felt like I wanted something that at least had a little bit of warmth in it.
Well, I think it definitely did. And your dystopias, we might talk about them a little bit later because they are extraordinarily evocative of what might have been. Midnight in Vienna, though, let's start there. Could you just tell the listeners a little bit about the book, what it's about, and who its protagonists are?
So it's set in 1938, and I really wanted to have a 1938 setting, partly because, to me, the world felt a bit 1938-ish, in that there's a sense that there's something rather kind of grim over the horizon, potentially, and a sort of sense of foreboding. But at the same time, a feeling that, you know, let's try and kind of immerse ourselves in some sort of comfort culture so that we don't have to think about it too much. And the real interesting parallel between 38 and today is that there was this massive craze for cozy detective fiction. So the golden age, which is Agatha Christie and Josephine Tey and Dorothy L. Sayers, was really at its height. It was this kind of, everybody loved this kind of detective fiction set in vicarages and on the Riviera, etc. And I thought, as I entered another bookshop and kind of stumbled across a huge dump bin of Richard Coles and Richard Osman, we've got a parallel there in that there is a great desire for cozy detective fiction today. So I thought it would be fun to feature a cozy detective novelist who's much less cozy than he seems. And so that was really my starting point for Midnight in Vienna, which is the story of starts with actually the death of this well-known detective novelist. And it involves two different protagonists, Stella Fry, who's an unemployed English tutor who's just returned from Vienna, where she was obliged to leave after the Anschluss, and Harry Fox, who's a disgraced, probably alcoholic, dyslexic, MI5 surveillance operative. And these two come together over the death of Hubert Newman, the detective novelist, and they realise that something much more serious going on. And their hunt takes them to really both to Vienna and also to the upper echelons of English society, just as the war is, well, it's all set over the Munich fortnight. So just as the war is debated.
I thought it was fascinating, the setting. That interesting to hear you talk about the parallel. So that late 1930s is an incredibly evocative period to work in. And one of the things I felt when I was reading it, there's one scene where your protagonist Stella is talking to a man from the Foreign Office who's genuinely terrified about what's happening in Europe and what's coming down the road, and he thinks that the government isn't paying enough attention to it all. And one of the things I thought you did really beautifully was create a kind of real sense of the historical present. These are people who don't know what's coming. It seemed to me quite useful to read it because it reminded me that actually things feel a bit sort of sinister now, but they're nothing as sinister as the world in 1938. The world in 1938 was genuinely horrifying.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Another parallel is that I think in 38, in the weeks running up to the Munich crisis, there were two camps. Some people who really were quite assured that the grown-ups in the room were going to sort something out and that war would be averted. And a much, I think, probably bigger and certainly more prescient camp who felt that people were sleepwalking into something really terrible, World War, and we very much needed to focus on rearmament and to take Hitler very, very seriously. So that division really interested me, because you will find today, okay, nothing's exactly parallel, but today you will find people who feel, because we've had a whole generation of peace and post-World War peace dividend, and we've had prosperity, you'll have people who believe that nothing really bad could happen. And others of us, which kind of include me, think that actually bad things might happen. And it's always very interesting, this balance between optimism and pessimism. I'm very struck, as I know you must be, by anyone that's studied the 1930s and the Jewish communities in Europe, particularly in Vienna. I was thinking there's a division between optimists who think nothing's going to happen. I fought in the Great War. I'm respected as a member of this community. It'll be all right. I'm going to stay. And pessimists who thought, actually, let's get out. Let's do everything we can to leave. And obviously the pessimists were right. And this isn't a doctrine of pessimism, but I think it's very interesting that you should examine all avenues and not just let the past dictate your future.
Yeah, absolutely. In the novel, there are two protagonists, and I guess one of them, they're both a little on the pessimistic side, but for different reasons. So can you just talk us through who the two main protagonists are? We've got Stella and Harry.
I particularly wanted this kind of made me laugh. I wanted two protagonists who were kind of really diametric opposites. Nothing original there. So I got these two characters who really wouldn't get on. So the Stella, she's in her early 30s. She's spent she went to Oxford and did languages and has spent some time on the continent as an English tutor to a family in Vienna, a rich family in Vienna, who are obliged to leave, and because they're Jewish. And she's come back. She doesn't have a job. She doesn't know what to do. And she's broken off with her boyfriend back in Austria because he joined the National Socialist Law Society. And she's really, uncertain what to do. And on the other hand, we have Harry, who's a surveillance operative, and he's actually been involved in, there was quite an interesting operation in the 1930s run by MI5, and you'll know about this, called the Red List, where they had a list of cultural figures, writers largely, actors, artists, who were felt to have subversive inclinations or to be Soviet sympathizers. And this list, these people on this list, which includes George Orwell, were followed by MI5 gumshoes. And quite recently, some reports came out of that these MI5 operatives had actually filed, and they make for hilarious reading. For example, one particular policeman who had to go to an evening with Stephen Spender at Hornsey Town Hall, and it was a lecture on the future of world socialism, but it was packed out, and the policeman had to hide in the lavatory and couldn't hear properly whether anything really subversive was being said. And it's so funny. All of it made me laugh. So I brought together these two characters. They normally wouldn't get on in any way at all, but they have one mission in common, which is that they both feel that Hubert Newman probably did not die a natural death.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the Red List, actually, because I thought that was wonderful, your portrayal of that, because one of the things, obviously, I read an awful lot of historical fiction, as you know, and one of the things I always look for is that sort of alchemy where a historical novelist can make the past seem very authentic and very real. And it was quite helpful to me in this case, because I felt I could judge your chops on this, Jane, because I'd read some of those files myself. And I thought it was fantastic the way you captured these there's a slight class element there too as well, because the guys in MI5 who were following these kind of intellectuals are kind of a slightly lower class, they're kind of a bit suburban, they're commuting in to do it. And these guys like Cecil Day-Lewis and Stephen Spender, they're all sorts of, upper middle, verging on higher. And there's a sort of hilarious mismatch of sort of 1930s class expectations between the watchers and the watched, and I thought you captured all of that really beautifully.
That's what I loved. I loved the class distinction. I've always been really amused by the fact that the MI5, which of course, as you'll know, came to its head during the final arrest of Philby, but this kind of distinction between MI6, who very much club and felt that, Philby, for example, was one of us, and his motives were not really properly be questioned, and the MI5, the much more sort of, Surbiton living gumshoes who kind of, had their suspicions. One of the starting points of this was that it concerned the Duke of Windsor, because before George the Fifth died, he became worried about the activities of his son, the future Edward VIII, and he actually got Baldwin and MI5 to convene a group of surveillance operatives who were called the Watchers, and they would follow and report on Edward and Wallace. And George V was incredibly worried that Edward was, louche, and that, Wallace was looking at all the red boxes and the classified papers, and they were just scattered around Fort Belvedere. And so the Watchers, this little group of operatives, reported back, and indeed it was pretty damning. And the things that they said about Wallace, and they discovered about Wallace trailing her to her various lovers in Mayfair, was probably enough finally to prepare the way for the abdication. Anyhow, the Watchers were disbanded after the abdication because Edward was out of the way and it's not a problem anymore. So they were reconvened to be the people who would follow the Stephen Spenders of the world. So that they had a history, and I liked this history, and I used it in the case of Harry. Harry had spent some time following Wallace Simpson, and something terrible had happened there. And that this shadow hangs over him and has been enough to get him suspended from MI5. So they've both got kind of traumatic pasts, and so match made in heaven.
They start investigating Newman, and like all the best detective novels, it's just a kind of way to get into a deeper, wider story, and I think it works brilliantly on that level. One of the there are so many strands, it's hard to pick them out, but one of the ones I adored, they have to investigate a detectives club, this extraordinary kind of collection of cozy crime writers who have this kind of club with arcane rules. Tell me, Jane, is this true? Did this exist?
Absolutely true. I mean, this is part of the whole kind of cultural landscape in the late 1930s, that detective fiction was taken so seriously that it was a kind of it was an art and a science, and the main forerunners of this were decided to form a detection club, it was called, and they would meet. It was like a kind of writers' club, except they took it terribly seriously, and they would dress up. There was an initiation ceremony where you would go and everybody be wearing black cloaks, and there was a skull that you would hold, and the candles and sort of various kind of occult paraphernalia, and you would swear allegiance to the rules of the detection club that had been drawn up. And the rules are all things like you may never use a character who hasn't appeared in the early part of the book. So the murderer can't be somebody that's not immediately obvious. You can't use a Chinaman is one of the rules, so it's hilarious. It's quite a lot of rules. And you would swear allegiance, and they all went. I mean, this was their idea of fun. And so all of them, Dorothy L. Sayers was was the kind of founding mother of it, and she loved it. So I just liked this. And at one point in the plot, Harry has to go and interview Dorothy L. Sayers because Hubert Newman had been in the detection club, and she unearths something or gives a hint of something that is actually the solution to the whole story, but Harry doesn't realize it at the time. But she was an amazing woman in herself, really very interesting woman, and unconventional. Had an illegitimate son at a time when that was very difficult to do, was a committed Christian, wrote an amazing book about Dante. So these people had kind of huge hinterlands, but the detection club I loved, and that comes into.
And is there, in the modern world, a current detection club, do we think? Does Richard Osman hang out with Richard Coles and Ian Rankin wearing funny robes and talking nonsense?
It's kind of, there's definitely cliques in the modern, unfortunately in the world of modern fiction. But I think it might be the case that the detection club is still ongoing. It's just the sort of thing that would have survived. I have to say, I'm not absolutely certain. I've just got an inkling about it. But of course, everybody now hangs out at literary festivals, so that's a modern equivalent, really. One of the reasons I included it is I thought that this was it offset the very, very serious and dramatic kind of gloom that was surrounding the country at that time in 1938. People were. It was a very disturbing time, as we all know, and Chamberlain was heading off to Munich 3 times, or the environs of Munich 3 times, and so I just wanted something that was slightly comedic that would offset the otherwise very desperately serious part of the rest of the plot.
There's one bit where you have a couple of your characters actually discussing why cozy crime detective novels fulfill a certain human urge. And I thought that was really interesting. You talk about, a human need to have kind of loose ends raveled up, and life isn't like that. And I thought it was quite an interesting way of looking at things. And also I hadn't really, until I'd read your book, understood that parallel between I'd seen the current trend towards cozy crime, but I hadn't realized really that it was also happening in the 30s. I think that's really interesting, that in times of peril we like our fiction, our deaths to be bloodless and our loose ends to be tied.
We absolutely do. And I think that in times of prosperity, you might think about the sort of 1970s, 60s, 70s, we had, say, the Hampstead Adultery novel, so it's just like kind of Iris Murdoch style, psychological realism of upper middle class people's lives. Whereas actually in times, I think fiction always mirrors the cultural climate. And in fact, I was very, at university, I did a paper on fiction in World War II. And I tell you what's really interesting is I went into thinking World War II fiction, everybody would be sitting writing about the Blitz and the blackout and, how frightening it is. Not a bit of it. What people were writing in World War II was Tolkien and Narnia, the Hobbit and Narnia. So it's a fantasy, Gormenghast, this great desire to actually abstract yourself when times are uncomfortable and to find something consoling, which makes total sense. But so I think war literature, I think The Hobbit and Narnia and also Gormenghast were in themselves kind of war literature. They were, let's imagine a totally different land. So in a way, the rise of fantasy we see today is that same thing of let's try and imagine ourselves somewhere else. And detective fiction fulfills a similar function. Let's find something we can solve, and the world restored to order.
And I suppose in both of them, in fantasy novels, if there is an evildoer, he will get his comeuppance. Just as in a cozy detective novel, the murderer's always going to get caught. And I suppose if you're living through the Blitz, and Sauron is a proxy for Hitler, you want to know that Sauron's going to be defeated by a small English person from the Shire with hairy feet.
You really do. And actually, but let's not forget the same recipe applies elsewhere. So Hitler had his own comfort reading in the form of a very popular Western, a writer of Westerns called Karl May. And the cowboy always won out and the Indians were always defeated. And that in itself was pretty sinister, because the Indians were seen in Karl May as a kind of sub race, and so it's not. I think the same concept of cultural consumption and cultural production mirroring political realities is something you see all over the place. I mean, I can't speak for Putin, but if you look back to Nazi Germany and look at Joseph Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister and in charge of the Reich Chamber of Culture, he monitored very carefully what the public mood was, and he adjusted cultural output to suit the cultural mood. So when things were very bad on the battlefront, he would have something that's lighter and more frothy, or if a lot of men were being lost, he would have films about brave housewives who were forging ahead to honor their husbands. And he would titrate almost his cultural output to suit the national mood or to offset the national mood. So it's fascinating. I mean, it makes total sense. Of course, culture is always a reflection and in a way, almost kind of like a medication for our political preoccupations.
In terms of preoccupations, it seems to me, Jane, talking to you now, that this is a particular period, the war, the late 30s and into World War II, that's obviously completely fascinated you throughout your career. I think, am I right in saying all your books have been kind of in and around?
Absolutely. I did 2 First World War ones, but absolutely, yeah. It's how can you not be interested? So one of the things that anybody that writes about World War II or the 30s and 40s, about 15 years ago, there was this big sort of sigh of fatigue of people saying, the World War II is over, just let's let it lie. And what's interesting to me is that that's sort of gone away, and people have realized that the ramifications of that particular war are ongoing. And I always think it's a similarity with the Trojan War. So the Trojan War is something that it was still spoken of 1,000 years or whatever after it was waged. So World War II, more seriously, is a war whose ramifications are, dictating events in the Middle East, and the reason that Putin is calling the Ukrainians Nazis. It's a really serious period, and the more you study it, the more fascinating it is, and the more it seems also to have lessons for us today. So I'm really preoccupied by it, and
with new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels on everything from lamps to ceiling fans, even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes, now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox, clean feels good.
Dripping in gold? That's cool. Dripping in Velveeta's supremely creamy golden cheesiness? That's respect. Elevate your drip with Velveeta's range of outrageously delicious dips and dishes. Shells, cheese, melty blocks, and heat and eat queso that go all in on indulgence. Flex on your fam with a creamy, cheesy masterpiece and go all in on what you love with Velveeta. Respect the drip and satisfy your cravings. Bring home the drip with Velveeta.
And I've written 14 books.
And do you think, because obviously in terms of nonfiction, it's an incredibly successful, like there's lots of people working in that space, writing a lot of nonfiction about it. What do you think historical fiction brings to the table in terms of making sure that people understand quite how important World War II is? Or should historical fiction even be trying to do that? Where's the balance between sort of entertainment and education?
Well, I think, I definitely think when I first got the idea of writing my first book about, I had a character called Clara Vine, who is an actress in Germany from the 30s through the 40s. And the reason that I wanted to write her was that I was very interested in what it was like for the women. It was about the time that Bashar al-Assad's wife, who was Asma, who had been brought up in Italy and went to school in London and did pieces in Vogue about her kind of sofas, was in Syria participating, I assume, in this blood-soaked series of atrocities. And I thought, what is it like for the wife? Does the wife of somebody who is this kind of monstrous dictator try and inhibit them and try and reason with them, or do they go along? And so what I did with the Clara Vine series was to look at the women in Nazi Germany, and particularly the wives of Emmy Goering and Magda Goebbels, and the wife of von Ribbentrop, and also Eva Braun, and look at them and try and find out what was going through their minds, because I just think it's the other half of history. We're now very used to wife lit, but when I started, it wasn't done so much. And I think you get a much fuller picture of a human being if you know what their marriage was like and what they were like. But that brings with it difficulties, because inevitably there's a million books about Goering and Goebbels and Hess, but about their wives, not so much. And so what I had to do was look at letters, to look at diaries that they wrote, to try and get their authentic feelings. Very usefully, in 1946, a lot of the Nazi wives that hadn't killed themselves were corralled in a camp together, and they were so bored that they wrote their own sort of autobiographies, and that was really useful. So admittedly, they were kind of self-justifying, but it was kind of useful to get the texture of their lives. So that's really what I wanted to bring to it. And I don't think fiction, my personal view of fiction is there are no rules. You can do anything you like. It's fiction. And but I I also think if you're writing about this period where so much awfulness happened, there is a sort of ethical duty to not get things dramatically wrong. And I very much wanted, when I was writing about Magda Goebbels or Emmy Goering, to actually reflect what they really did say and think. And it was easy with Magda Goebbels because she wrote tons of letters, and Emmy Goering wrote her autobiography, and Ava Brown wrote lots and lots of letters to her sister. So, it was possible.
It's interesting, that thing about the kind of ethical responsibility to getting it right. Do you think that's a more profound responsibility for this period than other periods, or do you think that's a kind of general, if you were doing a historical novelist club like the Detection Club, would that be one of your rules, that one has an ethical responsibility to the history?
Yeah, I think the Holocaust is the greatest mass murder, deliberate mass murder of humans in past centuries, and yeah, I actually think it is a special case. And I think if you're writing about concentration camps and things, particularly when people want to learn about that period and they're turning to historical fiction often to actually learn about it, I think there is a greater weight of responsibility there. And I'm slightly allergic to scenes in concentration camps and books about concentration camps. I don't want to name any of them, but there've been a few recently. I'm allergic to that because I just feel that's been a cause of so much suffering that you don't want to treat it lightly in any way.
I agree. I've read a few books recently, and I felt like the Holocaust was being used as a scenic backdrop for a kind of plot, and I felt deeply uncomfortable about that. And I also felt, and I don't know if this is a reasonable thing, I think that as an author, if you want to write a book about the Holocaust, you should look in the mirror and say, are you one of the best fucking writers in the world? And if you're not, you shouldn't write a book about the Holocaust. It's my personal view.
That's a really good point. We've all got our, I've never written any sort of scene which has Hitler in it, or Hitler talking, there's one scene in which somebody sees him from afar, but I just didn't want to write about Hitler. On the other hand, I've written a lot about Goebbels, and the interesting thing about Goebbels is that he kept prolific numbers of diaries because he saw this as his contribution to posterity. So we really do know what went through Goebbels's mind. And actually, there's one particular sort of a series of events in his life that we can see from his diary, which I think had a very profound outcome. I'll tell you about it. He was a great womanizer, and he loved the casting couch. And in 1936, Goebbels met an actress and fell hopelessly in love. And her name was Lida Barova. She was Czech. And he was swept away, and he would send her messages all the time. He would say, I'm going to be giving a speech. I'll wear a red handkerchief in my breast pocket. And that means I kind of, and he would ring her up and not say anything just so he could hear her breathe on the line and things like this. Desperately in love. And he was unfortunately married with 5 children at the time. And so we know this from his diaries. He would nag at Magda, his wife, every day. I would like Lida to come and live in our house with us. I'm a very senior man. I'm entitled to 2 wives, and I want her just to come and be with our family, And night after night in his diary, he would say, Magda is so insensitive. She completely refuses to have Lida come and live here. This is intolerable for me. Eventually, 1938, Magda gives in and she says, oh, all right then, she can come and live with us. And along comes Lida and moves in. And on the first day, Magda sees that Lida has this beautiful diamond ring. And this is very, very bad because this is identically the same to the beautiful diamond ring that Goebbels has just given her as a thank you for having the ménage à trois. Anyhow, she flips. At this moment, she goes to Hitler, and this is summer 1938. She goes to Hitler and she says, I can't stand it any longer. I want a divorce. And Hitler goes berserk and says, you were the first family in the Reich. You're in the magazines all the time. You represent everything that's good and pure. There's no way, you're getting a divorce. I'm sending Lida Barova back to Prague, and you are going to do a ton of more magazine interviews about how happy you are. So he calls in Goebbels, gives Goebbels this almighty bollocking. Goebbels cries as he records, and Hitler says he can't come to a certain part of the office anymore. His access is restricted. Goebbels is distraught night after night. What can he do? Lida has been banished. What can he do to get back in Hitler's good books? And then he has an idea, and he plots this idea with the head of the police in Berlin. And the idea he plots is Kristallnacht, which November the 10th, 1938, biggest pogrom of Jews since the Middle Ages, tens of thousands of people arrested, synagogues burned, was the event that finally woke America up properly to what Nazi Germany was like. It's huge, let's put it this way, PR disaster for Nazi Germany, but a terrible staging point. And Goering and Hitler livid, and Goebbels has basically screwed up. And he's done all this because of what happened in his personal life. The personal has become political. And you only see this when you see his diaries and you understand the story. And so for me, that was an absolute confirmation that it's important to know about people's private lives, because particularly powerful people, it guides their decisions that affect millions of other people. So that was the point I'm making is that Goebbels kept diaries. That's useful because we understand what he's thinking at any one point. But there are different ways into this.
And as a novelist, I think that's a kind of amazing gift that you have, is that, whereas a historian needs to be a bit more circumspect, as a novelist, you get to sort of jump in with both feet and say, okay, with all due respect to the research material and with all attempts at authenticity, I'm going to join some dots here, and I'm going to create, a sort of fictional representation of something that feels true. And that's an incredibly powerful thing.
And and you don't have to join too many dots, because obviously pre-internet and pre-mobile phone, the great thing was people wrote letters, people wrote to each other, they write stuff down, and thus, as you know, all we kind of now writing about it have access to files. Obviously, that's not going to be something that people have in the future, because famously people don't use email and things. So that has been, so it wasn't too difficult, particularly with the Lida Barova incident, because everybody involved wrote about it endlessly. So you get all the dirt. But it's all often puzzled me, quite apart from the fact that I do think that we should study World War II and its ramifications. It's also interested me that why do people write about Nazis per se? And it's a bit like, why do people write about Tudors? They happen to be this grouping of people who people seem to know about. They know the names, and I think, well, I understand why people write about Nazis, but you made a point earlier that the younger generation aren't so interested. Or if they are interested, they're more interested in sort of like zombie Nazis or sort of fantasy Nazis. And that's concerned that Nazis in a way have just become a sort of cipher historically, rather than real living, breathing people, which is all the more reason to bring them back as real people.
To circle back to your book, we've been very wide ranging, but to circle back to it, so your character Stella goes out to Vienna as a young woman and works there as a for a Jewish family who have to leave, and then she goes back to Vienna in the course of this book. And one of the things I really adored was the sense of place that we get in the book, both of London in 1938 and then in Vienna. And your portrait of Vienna is really interesting. Some of your characters kind of call it like the center of the world, and it seems and I'm fascinated by pre-World War II Vienna, but why that city, and why did you give it such import?
Oh, well, it was, because it had been so, I mean, it was a real nexus, Vienna, in the 20th century. Of you had lots of immigration from the East, and you had a very strong and thriving Jewish community. So you had people like Sigmund Freud, you had painters like Egon Schiele, and architects like Adolf Loos. So you had all different, philosophy, psychology, art, and indeed writing, congregating in this cafe culture, this beautiful, beautiful city. But also it was an absolute, vanguard of anti-Semitism. There was very, very strong anti-Semitism there before the war, and Vienna had gone through these great political troubles in the 20s, these sort of battles between communism and fascism, and then of course you have the Anschluss. And so I was very keen to get what it would be like for somebody who'd lived in Vienna before 1938, and then to go back and just see the swastika banners, see the horrors that were being inflicted on Jewish people then, and just see the difference. The facades are the same, the city's still beautiful, but it's somebody else's conception of Vienna. And of course, the interesting thing about Vienna, because Hitler was Austrian and Vienna had been this holy grail place for him too. And he wanted to join the School of Fine Art and be accepted. And he was rejected twice in a row, and he'd lived in this sort of penniless tenement, and revenge had burned in his heart for more than a decade. Vienna had been the place that he wanted to come back to. And finally, after the Anschluss, of course, he enters Vienna March the 12th, when, lines of tanks. And he had expected that people would throw stones and bricks and kind of there would be resistance. And instead, hundreds of thousands of people threw roses in his path. And he called it Blumenkrieg, a war of flowers, because he had expected it to be hard and it was so easy. And this was his great triumph, to take Vienna that had spurned him all those years ago. So I think Vienna is so interesting for so many reasons, but I kind of wanted, and of course, we shouldn't forget that it was a centre of communist. So there were many communists based in Vienna as well, and they created, as we see in the film The Third Man, this kind of network through the sewers of escape and communication, this tunnel network underground. So. And indeed, Vienna was the starting point for the Cambridge Five. As you know, Philby had gone to Vienna after university, and there was a key character who recruited many of the Cambridge Five who'd studied psychology, Deutsch, and he'd studied psychology in Vienna University, and then he'd come over to England, and he'd specifically looked for young men who fitted a certain template. They'd be well-born, they'd be intelligent, but they'd be at odds with themselves. They would be slightly unsettled and embarrassed by their class origins. So he knew enough psychologically to find the right recruits, and he found Philby and MacLean, and it was so Vienna was a starting point, and that's why it had kind of outsized importance in Britain's destiny as well.
That point that you make about the flowers at Hitler's feet is such a good one. It sort of sums up why it is, lots of what we've been talking about why it's important for novelists and historians to keep talking about this, because we're in danger of forgetting that there were flowers at his feet as he walked into Austria.
Yeah. And, we can see the photos, but just you really want to feel what it's like. And of course, I mean, it's very interesting, Vienna, going back to Vienna, which I've done several times recently. It feels to me almost like a museum now. It's strange. It's still beautiful, but it's much emptier. And I always think inevitably anywhere where Jewish people are driven away gets the life sucked out of it. But it doesn't feel like, and patently isn't, that nexus of thought and imagination that it was 100 years ago. And, that happens to cities, and the caravan moves on, but its past is, phenomenal.
One of your characters, in fact, is a professor who is a real character, Lindemann, who's a great friend of Churchill's, who becomes his scientific advisor in later life. And there's, some really fascinating stuff in the book. Another strand about the scientists, a lot of Jewish scientists who kind of fled Germany and Austria in the years before the war. And then, I don't want to give away too much because it all happens quite late in the novel, that, it all kind of starts feeding into the plot about these various scientists. So that was fascinating. That whole kind of the transfer of intellectual power that came with the terrible persecution of the Jews is really another fascinating strand of 30s history.
So one of the interesting things in any conflict is the attention towards intellectuals and what happens to intellectuals in war. Lindemann was a very inspired man, grumpy, bad-tempered, fantastically important to Churchill. In 1933, when Hitler came to power and decided that there weren't going to be any more Jews in universities, and somebody pointed out to Hitler that actually it was mainly the Jews who were doing the science, and Hitler said, in that case, we'll do without science. So a lot of unemployed Jewish brilliant intellectuals, nuclear physicists and the like. And Lindemann took his Rolls Royce, drove to Germany, drove around the universities and collected them. Said, do you want to come and work in either Oxford or Cambridge? Einstein came, Schrödinger came, a host of others came, and he found them posts. And so Germany lost crucially important theoretical physicists, etc., at that time. And this is a point in the plot, but I think that's very, very interesting. I mean, I've always in another novel I wrote about the operation at the end of World War II, where the Allies competed for intellectual firepower. So we know that, for example, Wernher von Braun went to help out in America with the nuclear bomb, but Britain was very concerned that it got its hands on nuclear scientists and that Russia didn't get them. There was sort of big sort of sharing out, or not sharing out. Britain brought as many as possible back, weirdly, to Wimbledon, where I am today, and they kept them and debriefed them as much as they humanly could before these scientists made their own decisions, and most of them cleared off to America. But the scrabble for intellectual scientific power is a crucial part of any conflict. And it was, if we've got time, I will tell you a story about Hedy Lamarr. Have we got time? Because
go on.
A marvelous, marvelous story. Also has its roots in Vienna. So Hedy Lamarr is, or was, a very famous actress. In the 1920s Vienna, she was the first ever woman to be filmed simulating an orgasm on film. She made a film called Ecstasy. It was a scandalous hit across Europe, and everybody was scandalized and went to see it. And Hedy was only 18. When she was 21, she met the second richest man in Austria, whose name was Fritz Mandl. He was an arms dealer, and she married him. And he said, look, from now on, I'm buying up all the negatives of your scandalous film. You're never going to act again. Your job now is to be my wife and to sit at dinner and to talk to my friends at dinner as a hostess. And all his friends at dinner were nuclear scientists or theoretical physicists, because he was very involved in producing weapons, developing weapons for the Nazis. So she sat in his castle night after night, having to talk to these people, desperate to get away, and kept trying to escape. And eventually, in 1937, she did escape, got across Europe, got to London, met Louis B. Mayer, went over to Hollywood with him, and he said, I will make you, A-list star. And she became Hedy Lamarr, changed her name, and became known as the most beautiful woman in the world. But in 1940, when a lot of Allied shipping was being targeted by U-boats, she became very concerned, and she wanted to do more. She didn't fed up with being an actress, and she wanted to do something. She sat next to somebody at a Hollywood dinner party, and he said, "Oh, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a scientific entrepreneur, and actually, I'm working on something to increase the size of women's breasts." But that was by the by. That was his opening line. She said, "I'm worried about Allied shipping being targeted, and I'd like to develop something that could stop this happening." He said, "Let's get together and work it out." They got together and they worked out something called frequency hopping, which is a way of jamming the signal that the U-boat sends to target the shipping. They took it to the War Office in 1940, and the War Office in America said, "We're not interested. We're going to file it. Can you go back to your career?" In 1960, they took this out, and they realized that she had invented Bluetooth. What Hedy Lamarr did was invented something that means that you have a mobile phone and that we have GPS satellite. And she was commemorated for this. But she said at the time, the reason she was able to invent it was all those nights sitting around a table at her husband's castle, listening to nuclear physicists talking about precisely these things. And so it's a kind of extraordinary reach back into the past, and tragic that actually the Americans never used it in World War II, but it's used by all of us today now.
I have to say, I went through a phase of reading lots of books about atomic physics, and I could, I think, go to a million dinners with nuclear physicists and never invent anything, because it goes in one ear and out the other very quickly. Jane, this has been absolutely fantastic, an absolute tour de force. Can you tell us anything about what happens next in your career? I'm guessing we might still be in 1930s, 1940s. Do we know what? I
tell you when we're in May 1940, the days leading up to the arrival of Winston Churchill, and it's our working title is Appointment in Paris, but I'm looking at a very interesting top secret centre that was established in the English countryside at that time. It's not Bletchley Park. And so my plot revolves around that, but it's also got a significant element in Paris. And so, yeah, it's great fun. It's great fun. So again, another 1940, May 1940, another crux point of history when people didn't know which way things were going to go. And an awful lot of people thought Halifax was going to be Prime Minister and wanted him to be, including the King. And we got Churchill. So that's Fox and Fry 2, and it's coming next year.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that Fox and Fry are back, because I think they're fabulous. And it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you about Midnight in Vienna. Thank you so much, Jane.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow, tweet, spread the word so that we can keep bringing you more brilliant writers talking about spies. Don't miss an episode of the Spymasters podcast.
The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in more places that could expose you more to identity theft. But LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, our US-based restoration specialists will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Don't face drained accounts, fraudulent loans, or financial losses alone. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.